Okay, hi everyone. Today we're looking at nurse education in the UK, and I'll talk a little bit about the history of nursing education within the 20th and now 21st century, focusing in particular on Project 2000 and what that meant for nursing education. And that was really about moving the way that nurses are taught and moving that into universities. So we'll look at why that was the case and the challenges that have come about as a result. Nursing itself has transformed enormously over the last 150 years, and alongside that the education of nurses has obviously had to change. Ronstadt has written about this, and she argues that nursing was initially seen as an overtly religious calling, so people were drawn to it for religious reasons, and it was also seen socially as an unselfish urge to tend the sick. But in the last 150 years, notions of nursing have transformed, and it's seen very much as a profession alongside other professions, and it's certainly within the UK now largely secular, so it's entirely removed from any religion or religious connotations. And that move is perhaps culminated or is best seen by the Nursing and Midwifery Council's announcement that in October 2008 that nursing was going to become an all-degree profession. So alongside medicine, veterinary science, accountancy, those are the disciplines, people who are nurses will automatically have degrees. You'll have to have a degree to become a nurse within the next few years. And that obviously has enormous implications for the way that nurses are educated. And from that you could assume that it's now an accepted academic discipline in its own right, and that the profession is seen as a profession by both those within it and society and the professions that work alongside nurses. But that's a matter of some debate, and according to Carr, writing in 2007, nursing inhabits what he sees as this uneasy social space between the true professions, such as law and medicine, so the more traditional ones, and what he's called the proletarian occupations of domestic and unpaid work, so what's traditionally quite menial, probably female tasks. He argues that whilst nursing has moved into the university sphere, so it has changed its reputation and what people believe of it, it hasn't gained the profile of a typical higher education subject, so its status is still not entirely fixed. And that means that it's still subject to criticism and comment from elements of the media, from the government, and even from within its own ranks. So from within the body of nurses or student nurses. And it could even be at risk of losing its place within university before it's really established. And as I say, there has been this evolution within nursing education. So initially, students were trained within schools of nursing attached to hospitals, and that was up until the late 80s, early 90s. Then there was Project 2000, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute or so, and that report recommended that nurses move into universities, and that's where they should receive their education. And as I say, from 2011 in Scotland and UK-wide by 2013, the only way that you can gain education and access to the nursing register is by enrolling on a degree programme. And this came about, as I say, through Project 2000. This was a report published in 1986. It was a seminal report written by what was then the nursing registration body, which was called the United Kingdom Central Council for Nursing, Midwifery and Health Visiting. And they argued that the current service-led, hospital-based apprenticeship model that was then in use basically wasn't fit for purpose. So it wasn't training, it wasn't educating nurses in a suitable way. They argued that there was a gap between theory and practice for students, so they weren't able to integrate elements of theory into their practice and vice versa. They also argued it was inefficient, so the dropout rate for student nurses was 65%, so 35% of people that started courses weren't finishing it. And because the students were included within the workforce, within the wards, that meant there was a high staff turnover. 35% of student nurses were leaving before qualifying. So the report recommended that there should be a 3-year programme of education for new nurses, and that this should take place within higher education institutions. The focus was a move towards more student-centred, professional and academic qualifications, and students would be given supernumerary status. They would no longer be part of the workforce, and they wouldn't be paid as such. They would have a very different status, one as a student. And the first course to emerge from these changes was validated in England in 1989 at diploma level. By 1996, 48 institutions in England were approved to provide the award, and the English Nursing Board at that point could claim that all nursing and midwifery education had been incorporated into higher education. And as I was saying earlier, by 2013, there will only be degree-level pre-registration nursing programmes available in the UK, so there won't be any other awards. You won't be able to leave with a diploma or anything else and still register as a nurse. And there were lots of reasons for this change. You know, I mentioned some of them. So there were these perceived weaknesses in the traditional model, but there'd also been enormous advances in the National Health Service and demographic changes. So healthcare had changed, society had changed, and what was required of nurses obviously had to change with that. And one of the big motivators behind the move was to try and recruit a wider cohort of people, so to make nursing more attractive to a wider group of people to consider. And that was done, the idea was to make it more professional, and therefore more people would consider it as a career amongst those other professions such as accountancy and so on. In addition, one of the fundamental concepts of nursing as a profession is the principle of evidence-based practice. So nurses do what they do because there's evidence underpinning it, because there's research, there's evidence out there that this is what should be done, rather than because that's what you're told to do or that's the way it's always been done. So this is a big concept within nursing. And in order for that to be the case, nursing students have to be supported in developing the skills to access that evidence. So they've got to be able to find the evidence base, they've got to be able to critically assimilate it, they've got to be able to utilise it, so understand the evidence and transfer it into practice. And they also need to contribute to what's increasingly a vast body of evidence. Also, it's really important to note that as healthcare has become more complex and nurses are providers within a multidisciplinary team, they have additional educational needs. They need to understand more complex issues, they need to be able to critically assess them, and they're becoming more autonomous as decision makers. And I think the quote I've got here from McKenna sums that up. He argues that to meet present and future health and social care challenges, nurses must be analytical, assertive, creative, competent, confident, computer literate, decisive, reflective, embracers of change, and the critical doers and consumers of research. For somebody to be able to do all of that, they really require a great deal of academic skills training, and that's why they needed to move into the university sphere in order to access that. But the education, this move hasn't been entirely smooth. There have been some challenges. One of the biggest difficulties is to do with funding and retention. So instead of being paid to work within hospitals, students are now often given bursaries. But the removal of that salaried status has obviously had an impact for some people, and often it's one of the reasons why students withdraw from courses, either because they can't afford to stay or because they're working doing so much part-time work to pay the mortgage and the bills and so on, that they can't put enough time into their university studies. So there's a lot of research to say that that's an issue. There's also issues to do with what's called widening participation. So there are policy drivers from the government and the NHS to open access to higher education in general, but also the nursing profession. The NHS, which is obviously the largest employer of nurses and the single largest influence on nursing education, has an explicit policy goal that its workforce should reflect the population that it serves. So in a modern, ethnically diverse, ageing Britain, a student nurse cohort of traditional, largely middle-class school leavers isn't going to reflect the population that it goes on to nurse. So there has been this move to widen access, to let in what's called non-traditional groups of students, to get them into university to be trained as professions. And whilst that's undoubtedly a worthy policy goal, such students can find the transition into higher education challenging. And again, the research suggests there's quite a few reasons for that. One of the issues can be that there's no family tradition, perhaps, of going to university. So nobody can really support a student in saying this is what a lecture's like, or yes, that's what an essay should look like, you're on the right path. They can lack what's called cultural capital, or institutional habitus, which is a concept developed by the philosopher Bourdieu and then developed into the university sphere by Liz Thomas in the 1990s. They can also non-traditional students can often have caring commitments. So there are a large group of mature students who perhaps have children or elderly relatives that they look after. And that obviously has an impact on how much they can engage with university and a 3, perhaps even 4-year course of education. So there's a lot of issues with moving students and nurse education into the university environment, but perhaps the most intransigent barriers, the biggest difficulties for full entry into this new university world and the new profession and fully recognised profession of nursing, remains popular hostility to such a move. Elements of the UK media, politicians and even some students and nurses argue that degree-level education isn't necessary, that nurses shouldn't go to university to learn nursing. Some even argue that it's harmful for the profession. So this tends to be a kind of harking back to some imagined golden age of nursing and allusions to caring and perhaps even obedience. And whilst this anti-intellectual current has always been around, recent changes to public finances and to government within the UK perhaps makes this kind of dissent more serious and a bit more of a risk to the university status of nursing education. So I've put there an example of a headline from the Daily Mail in 2009 which said, "You don't learn compassion at universities." And if you follow discussion boards on those papers when they're talking about similar topics, you'll see that there's often quite broad popular support for that kind of view. David Cameron, the current Prime Minister, said in 2010 that nurse training was too academic. He said that there was too much over-academised training and not enough hands-on training, and went on to say that at least half of a nurse's time should be spent, half of a student nurse's time should be spent on clinical placement, which is in fact the case even in university education. But again, it suggests that there is perhaps a certain hostility to the move to university education.